the first time, the U.S. has not vetoed a UN Security Council resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza, although, as we're going to get into, they successfully watered it down before it passed. But still, there is something historic about what's just happened.
Well, yeah, that this is sort of a vision of a world without the U.S. And it's the first time a ceasefire resolution has passed. I actually want to start this one. It's not in our notes, but I want to start by just showing the reaction to this vote as it passed, because this is unusual. And obviously, if you look at the reaction, long overdue.
Draft resolution contained in document S/2024/254. Please raise their hand. Those against? Abstention. The result of the voting is as follows: 14 votes in favor, 0 vote against, 1 abstention. The draft resolution has been adopted as Resolution 2728, 2024.
So
if you follow these UN Security Council resolutions, you almost never see that happen. People applauding after a vote, and you can see it's palpable because people are so relieved that for the first time the U.S. has not blocked a resolution calling for a ceasefire, which the whole world supports, and that's why you see the applause there at the end.
Yeah, the U.S. has blocked how many? 3 so far?
At least more if you count amendments. And in this case too, they did block an amendment, or at least they blocked wording that would have called this ceasefire permanent. They changed that to lasting, I believe, because they don't want to foreclose the possibility of Israel resuming its genocide campaign. And Linda Thomas Greenfield, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, she went out of her way to explain in her little speech on this vote that this is a non-binding resolution. So basically, if you listen to her carefully here, it's pretty clear the Biden administration strategy is, rather than humiliate itself with yet another veto, they're going to let this one pass, but just declare that it's non-binding.
This is self-described Louisiana.
Members of this council to take some of our edits and improve on.
Sorry, Max, say it again.
No, go ahead.
This resolution. Still, certain key edits were ignored, including our request to add a condemnation of Hamas. And we did not agree with everything in the resolution. For that reason, we were unfortunately not able to vote yes. However, as I've said before, we fully support some of the critical objectives in this non-binding resolution. And we
notice how quickly she said in this non-binding resolution. She said it kind of in passing, but that's their line now. So this is not actually enforceable by UN Security Council action. This is just non-binding.
Believe it was important for the council to speak out and make clear that our any ceasefire must come with the release of all hostages. Indeed, as I've said before, the only path to a durable end to this conflict is the release of all hostages.
So there it is. It's non-binding. That's why the U.S. didn't veto it. So they let it pass, but they're also saying it's toothless.
And you know, before we just analyze the impact of the resolution on a potential Israeli assault on Rafah and everything else, let's consider what kind of language the U.S. was trying to insert into this resolution, because we hear Linda Thomas Greenfield complaining that it didn't condemn Hamas. Here is her discussing the U.S. the language the U.S. wanted.
Suffering. and I urge all council members to vote yes, to vote for a resolution that at long last condemns Hamas for its horrific terrorist attacks and sexual violence, that makes clear that all civilians.
So the U.S. wanted to insert condemnation of Hamas for systematic mass rape on October 7th, something that to this point has been exposed as a gigantic hoax put forward by the Israeli government. And basically what they're doing is they're raising the bar so much that it's impossible to actually meet the U.S. bar. And that gives them a way to abstain because the U.S. can't possibly vote in support of a permanent ceasefire resolution. That would never be possible. But they at least relieved the Security Council of having to deal with a U.S. veto. And for the first time, we have at least a ceasefire resolution, however non-binding it might be. This is infuriating Netanyahu. Netanyahu has pledged to withdraw a delegation he was going to send to Washington, where the Biden administration was going to plead more for them not to go into Rafah. I think the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, is already here in Washington. And it's a way of Biden screwing over Netanyahu because he is going to be invited by House Majority Leader Mike Johnson to address a joint session of Congress in a repeat of Netanyahu's address to Congress when he stabbed Barack Obama in the back over the Iran deal at the invitation of Republican House Majority Leader John Boehner. So basically, Netanyahu is interfering in U.S. politics. This is Biden's way of getting him back. It's the second abstention we've seen maybe in the last decade of a resolution that Israel opposed. The other one was on Israeli settlement activity. The Obama administration abstained. So basically, this has a lot to do with U.S. domestic politics, and the Biden administration also not, I don't think they could afford to just veto another ceasefire at this point, with famine looming, with every aid agency operating in the region warning of imminent famine. I think it was a little extreme. So it really just shows how pathetic they are, that they can't actually support the resolution, and that they were still twisting arms to water down the language in support of Israel, while Tony Blinken is acting as Israel's lawyer and pushing the Israeli line in negotiations in Doha.
Yeah, and it comes just days, and this is really worth stressing. As we saw in that last clip from Linda Thomas Greenfield, they were trying to push this resolution pretending to call for a ceasefire, which Russia and China vetoed. And when Russia and China did that, the U.S. did that, and the U.S. media followed suit and trying to pretend as if Russia and China were now opposed to a ceasefire, when really, if you read that U.S. text, it's like it called for, it supported the imperative of a ceasefire, which is weird wording, the imperative of a ceasefire, not imposing a ceasefire, the imperative of a ceasefire in connection with the release of all hostages. So basically, it's just repeating Israel's demand that Hamas release all of its captives, and then Israel gets to resume the genocide when it wants to, because the U.S. resolution even allowed for Israel to conduct future operations. So it was a transparent scam to not only pretend to call for a ceasefire, but also, as we saw in that clip from Linda Thomas Greenfield, to push and validate the talking points used to justify the genocide by asking the UN to condemn Hamas for alleged sexual violence. So that was a complete scam, which Russia and China vetoed. And now, sufficiently humiliated, they were forced to let this one pass today. But again, they're doing it on the condition that this is non-binding in their view. This is not. So basically, they're saying we let this pass because it's toothless. It can't be enforced.
And I mean, smaller states like Guyana or Algeria lit into the U.S. over the sham that it was trying to pull at the UN. Let's listen to like 30 seconds of the Guyanese delegation explaining why they could not support the U.S. resolution.
Contrary to some media and other reports, this resolution does not call for an immediate ceasefire. Instead, we note that it, and I quote, determines the imperative for a ceasefire end of quote, and calls for support for diplomatic efforts that are ongoing outside of the UN. The demand for a ceasefire should not be linked to or conditioned on the release of hostages. Two wrongs cannot make a right, and the Palestinian people should not be collectively punished and themselves held hostage for the crime of others.
So, I mean, pretty plainly spoken. And what she's saying is the U.S. is trying to deprive the Palestinians, force them to give up all their negotiating leverage and basically end all negotiations for the release of their own hostages, people who've been languishing in Israeli prisons under increasingly harsh conditions, in order to not get slaughtered and ethnically cleansed. And here's the Israeli anti-ambassador to the UN, someone who would like to wage a series of drone strikes on the UN building, Gilad Erdan, I think one of the worst diplomats to ever serve in the history of humanity. And I don't just mean that as someone who would like to see the Zionist project dismantled right now. I'm saying that just as an objective observer of diplomacy. This is someone who's done enormous damage to Israel's cause.
There is no country that seeks to avoid an operation in Rafah more than Israel. Is it your sons and daughters that you are sending into battle? No, it is our children who are making the ultimate sacrifice in defense of their homeland. The only way to achieve a real and permanent ceasefire is to eliminate Hamas's capabilities entirely. And this cannot happen unless all of their battalions are demolished. You cannot extinguish a fire by putting out most of it. The fire will grow again and spread. This is what will happen without an operation in Rafah.
Well, I'm glad he's replaced his Nuremberg Law era Jewish star with just the ribbon that, celebrities wore at the Oscars. But, consider the logic there. There can't be a ceasefire without a gigantic massacre in an area where 1.5 million refugees are concentrated in order to dismantle the Hamas battalions that Israel has failed to dismantle in the north. Why are they at Al-Shifa Hospital? We'll talk about this later. Why is Israel blowing up the surgical ward of Al-Shifa Hospital? Why are they carrying out field executions outside Al-Shifa? Why are they arresting all the journalists there? Because they have failed to demolish Hamas in the north where they withdrew their troops. So they've totally failed militarily. And now they're failing diplomatically. They've irritated Biden to the point where they're at least abstaining. And, it's a free fall from here. What are they going to do? Lean on the congressional Republicans and wait till Trump gets into office? That seems to be the strategy.
Yeah, well, there was this proposal for Netanyahu to come and address Congress, just as he did to undermine the Iran nuclear deal when Obama was president. And Netanyahu has canceled this Israeli delegation's visit to Washington. They were about to leave on a flight from Tel Aviv, so they canceled that flight of Genocide Airlines. But then you have to wonder how much of that is just performative. How much of that is actually just Netanyahu and Biden playing off each other. Biden gets to pretend as if he's standing up to Israel. Netanyahu gets to pretend as if he's standing up to the U.S. when really the same support will continue. The arms are still flowing. The Senate just voted to strip funding for UNRWA. By the way, Chris Van Hollen, Democratic senator, has been speaking out against the attacks on UNRWA. He voted for that measure as well. So Netanyahu still has the support, not only Biden, but even of Democrats who are supposed to be his staunchest critics.
$3.8 billion more of weapons to Israel, eliminating UNRWA, which is the main provider of education, aid, food to the majority of the population of Gaza. So that's U.S. Congress. It really shows, like, if anyone pays members of Congress enough, they'll vote for anything. I mean, that's really all that happened.
Yeah. And Israel
So-
Israel followed up that vote by announcing that they're not going to let any UNRWA trucks deliver anything to the north. So, the Senate basically, including Democrats, put their rubber stamp on Israel continuing to try to destroy UNRWA, including blocking its trucks from entering the north.